Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedictine. And if you are new to the show, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for hanging out with us. If you're already a listener, welcome back. Glad to have you again. Today, we're going to talk about a 60-minute piece that CBS News just released. It's featuring Rick Rubin, a legendary producer. And this 60-minute piece, this video interview, caused some pretty wild discussions on the internet. My Facebook feed was full of it. Rick Rubin explained his role and said, on this interview, he explained his role and said things like, I don't know anything about music. I can barely play a few instruments. I don't know how to operate a mixing desk. I have no technical ability, etc. And people were asking, like, why is he called a producer then? Like, what is a producer if he can't do any of those things? Why is he a producer, and why has he made all of these hit records, and what is he actually getting paid for? So let's discuss this. As always, I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood, of course. How are you, buddy?
Hey, man. I'm very good. How are you, sir?
I'm good, too. Thank you so much. I got an interesting thing to share before we dive into this, before I forget again, because I forgot in the last episode. I got an email from a listener, and at first it was like just a normal email or a reply to a newsletter that I sent out. But then as I read it, it was fascinating because the email came from a gentleman called Rudy Torreyes, I think is the way to pronounce it. Rudy Torreyes, and he is 93 years old, and he's listening to our podcast. And yeah, and he's
That's
a singer.
So cool.
And a couple of years ago, he I think was second or third. Sorry, Rudy, if I get that wrong. In a singing contest, like a professional contest. And there's a video of him online that has a couple of thousand or tens of thousand views actually. Where, let me just look that up. Yeah, it's an AARP contest thing. He was in the finals of that, and he took second, I think. In 2015 was that, and it's amazing. He's a phenomenal singer, and I looked that up, and he apparently people know him, and yeah, he's still on stage. He's enjoying it. He's loving it. He's recording himself. Apparently, he's listening to our show, and I just found that to be super fascinating. So, Rudy, you rock. Cool. Thank you so much for listening to the show, and thank you for reaching out.
Yeah. Thank you. That's awesome. I love when people reach out. Like another email we got, Benny, was from Adam J. He just reached out to connect and say that he loves the podcast and stuff, and then he casually mentioned that he was in a band called One Bad Son, which had phenomenal success in Canada, especially.
Really?
I'm like, oh, it's a giant rock band, great! Like, how cool is that?
What was that? The one you sent over to me?
I forwarded to you. Yeah.
Oh,
totally.
I had no idea about the band. I just
thought
it
One
was
Bad Son's a really cool band, and
wow.
they were a huge inspiration for my band. Just a Canadian rock band killing it, doing big shows kind of thing. And so yeah, very cool. I know Adam has left the band in I think he said 2018 or something in that email. I can't remember, maybe it was earlier, but I know the drummer Kurt Dahl, I've had him on my other podcast here, Band Sucks at Business, because he's an entertainment lawyer. It's just probably the leading music and entertainment lawyer in Canada. I'd say he's a phenomenal wealth of knowledge kind of thing. And he's also a drummer in One Bad Son. So it's just the coolest guy you could ever meet.
Awesome.
But yeah, and then I had no idea that Adam was a listener as well. So cool.
So cool to hear that sort of stuff. Great. Awesome.
Yeah. Keep reaching out to us, people. We really get a kick out of knowing who's out there.
Absolutely. And I hope so much that I will be recording and making music when I'm 93. That's so cool.
So awesome.
Yeah, awesome. So let's go to today's show. So on this episode, we are answering, as I said, questions like, how does Rick even mean all of this? Rick Rubin, is he just being modest? What does he get paid for? All these things. Aren't those the things exactly that a producer typically does or needs to know? Maybe it doesn't even matter as much as people think. And what is it that the producer actually does? And what does those people get paid for? So what are your thoughts initially, Malcolm? I know you haven't seen the piece, I think. I've watched it. But just from that whole topic, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprising that there was a reaction of people, probably people that do modern day production and engineering, that were wait, then how is he a producer? He's not doing all these jobs I've come to do or expect producers to do, like the engineering of the entire session. So I totally get that. And I think, personally, maybe they're right in that the modern producer needs to have all those skills. But ultimately, with Rick Rubin, the proof is in the pudding. The guy's
Yeah.
got the most insane track record of hugely successful songs ever. And I think instead, everybody that had that reaction needs to completely reverse it and have a 180 and look at how can I be more like Rick Rubin and what would that look like?
Yeah.
Because what he's doing is getting those results,
Yeah.
not the other way around. So some people are going to be totally aware of this, but I think for some of our listeners that they'll have no idea. But the producer and the engineer used to be totally isolated and separate jobs, where the producer was not required to have any engineering skills because that is not their job, where the engineer didn't have to have any creative necessarily songwriting skills because they're just in charge of capturing it. Recording engineers literally used to wear lab coats. Like they were scientists more so than musicians.
True.
Which is just insane to think, right? Obviously the world has changed a huge amount since then, and I'm sure we can dig into why that is. And why those jobs are so fused today. Because I think the modern producer, like when I would have called myself a producer, I was more so an engineer than a producer, but I had to do both. It's fascinating. What are your initial thoughts, Benny?
I think that I completely agree, first of all. Yeah, I think there's both sides. So personally, I agree that his credits speak for themselves and what he's done. And I think that the traditional role of a producer has nothing to do with technical ability. It's about building a team. It's about having a vision, about having taste, about knowing whether or not something resonates or works. And Rick Rubin is one of those people who says you can't predict the future. You can't predict how people are going to react. You can't predict what people are going to like, but you can make you can have an opinion, you can have a taste, and you can tell the engineer and the artist and the label if you like it or not. And you can only hope that this is also true for an audience. But he just has a feel for, I don't know, how the music connects and translates, and if the emotion and the sonics and all of that, if that goes together well. He just has a feeling for that, and he has a strong vision and strong taste. He's not afraid to make bold moves too. So some of his records that he's been involved with have pretty controversial sounds on them, and things that initially people hated, but still they got wildly popular. So there's the traditional role of a producer. But I also think that today, the challenge is to be able to do all of that and to also know the engineering side of it, because you have to do all of it yourself. Mm-hmm. And even professional producers or engineers are oftentimes both. When I was still recording a lot, I was both a producer and engineer. Now, when I'm mixing for people, I'm almost like a remote producer, because I give feedback on their stuff, and I'm involved creatively for sure. So I think today, what's considered a producer is someone who knows some of the engineering at least too. And oftentimes people say producer, but they mean engineer with additional production jobs or like skills. And so, but I think that first and foremost, it's really important to understand that there is this role that is completely separate from the technical side of it, and that you can absolutely be an outstanding producer and be worth a lot to those artists and labels, and also get paid a lot, and also have a big impact on these records without knowing a mixing desk and without being able to play an instrument, even as long as you like what he does very well. And we've both never worked with him, but from what we know, and the interviews that people gave and he gave and stuff, and the books and podcasts and everything that's out there, I did a lot of research on him because I found him fascinating always. So what he does really well is he, first of all, builds an amazing team. He knows who's the right mixing engineer, the right recording engineer, the right session musicians, and all of that for that project. So he brings in all these geniuses, which obviously helps. And then he makes sure that he doesn't, and that's sometimes something that people get wrong too. He makes sure that he doesn't spend too much time in the room with the music. And sometimes people say like he's coming in, he's sitting there for an hour, and then he's leaving, and he gets paid a lot of money. And part of, I think, why he is so good is that he has a different perspective. He's as objective as possible. He doesn't have to listen to it for 10 hours. It's enough for him to listen to it a couple of times and then make a decision and move on. And then he lets the other people do what they are best, and then he comes back in and gives feedback again. And so what's really valuable is this perspective, this creative genius that he has, like the vision, the taste. and the ability to get people in the room who can execute that vision, basically. And that's what he's been being paid for. And it definitely works.
Now, what's fascinating is that it's impossible to have that perspective if you're also engineering the record, because you have to be stuck there focusing on transient response of the pick your guitar player is using, like those stupid things, right, which do add up to a great result. But any moment you're thinking about the engineering, which is ultimately what that comes down to, you are no longer thinking about that big picture producer stuff. Like most modern producers are also engineers, and probably more so engineers than producers. But you are doing both. I don't even think I'm saying that you shouldn't do both, but I'm saying that you should, in your head, you should consider them different jobs to make yourself more aware of the production elements so that you're actually spending more time focusing on those if possible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that we touched on that on some other episodes too, where we said that this is the biggest challenge that DIY musicians have, basically DIY engineers, that you have to wear all these hats. And if you're the artist, the writer, and the performer at the same time too, then it gets even more difficult. You got to write a good song. Then you got to be the judge if that's actually a good song, and then you got to arrange it, and you got to record it and engineer it and play it, perform it, mix it, master it, all of that. It's super difficult to do that, to do all of that well, to make sure that there's some separation and some shift in perspective and stuff. It's like very, very hard to do.
So challenging. The line of what is production gets blurred as well. Like for me, I think deciding what the guitar tone should sound like is a producer's role. Like that's a sonic decision that's going to affect how the song feels to me. But then achieving that sound is the engineer's job. So it's a really close line.
Yeah. Now, why is it that people are confused about this? Like, what do people think or is a producer is, or what is the word producer being used for these days oftentimes?
I think for engineering, really, a producer is setting up the drum mics. And again, kind of it is, right? Because they're deciding like how that's going to sound. Like it's at the expense of talking about the song probably. Or the performance. It's so tricky. I almost think we should maybe first talk about why that's happened and why one person is doing both jobs, which really ultimately just boils down to budgets, I think.
Yes, I think so. I think so too. Budgets and the ability that at some point you didn't have to have a commercial big studio facility anymore that has staff and a team and like labels with producers and all that who would rent that out. Like I think as soon as people were able to have their own home studio or project studio and do it on their own, that's where it kind of changed. So it's partly a budget thing, but it's also just the fact that you can just set up a studio, bring bands in and make a record, and automatically you are the producer and the engineer and everybody else if you don't bring in other people. So people just assumed that when they can build a studio and get some gear, they can be the producer and the engineer, and they didn't want to pay to bring in an extra producer, right? Or an extra engineer. So they did it because they thought they could. When back in the day, the producer was hired by the label most of the time. The label wanted to put out a product and they needed a writer and an artist and session musicians and a producer. And oftentimes they hired a producer and his job was to make that product a reality. And then he or she brought the people together so that this could happen. So this was how it was done often. And then later it was more like a band picked a studio and the person operating the studio is the engineer and the producer and all of that.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting to think that you can make a record without a producer, but you can't make a record without an engineer, but you can't make a good record without a producer.
Yeah, that's right. That's
very
right.
fascinating.
And these days, that you got to be aware of the fact that the band, even if you work as a band, you work with mixing engineers or recording engineers, even in most cases, the band is actually the producer. Mm-hmm. And so you should have a conversation about this with your engineer or the producer you hired. There should be an agreement that clearly says like, are we hiring this person for engineering and mixing, or are we hiring a producer? Because that will determine how much that person will bring to the record creatively. So when I'm hired, I always have a conversation about this, and I'm like, do you just want me to capture this and mix it and you make the creative decisions? Or are you happy with me giving feedback or even adding parts or rearranging things, or different for different people in projects? But you have to have a conversation about this, because if you tell me that I am producing, I will be producing. And if you tell me that you don't want that, and it's your songs and they should stay the same, I don't consider myself a producer. I'm then just an engineer, which is fine too, but that has to be talked about, and it can be easily confused when people say they want a producer but they don't talk about this stuff, and then the producer thinks he or she is a producer, but the band actually wanted an engineer. So
yeah. Now, let's flip this on its head. Interesting little idea I'm having right now is that I think people don't necessarily understand what a producer's responsible for as well. So a musician in a band might be like, well, I'm the producer. But it's important to know then what's on the line there and what your job is to accomplish. Because ultimately the end product, the quality of that is entirely your job.
Yes.
So like if it sounds like a dated, like say you're making a big rock song and you end up with like a mono guitar, mono bass, and like a very like a John Bonham mic'd drum kit and one vocal, like as sparse could be for a rock production, but it's meant to sound like a big new metal mix. That's your fault.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, and you might think, no, that's the engineer's fault. They're the one making the sounds. It was like, no, your job is to convey how it's meant to sound, and they're meant to achieve it. It's your job to know, okay, well, we need a big wall of guitars. We need huge, tight, modern drums. Like that's all the producer's job. The product, the end thing that gets released is produced from the producer.
100%, exactly. And so that also means you got to make decisions and you got to commit if you're a producer. So if you're telling me you're producing and you only need a mixer and you produced it and engineered it and all of that, then I assume that the takes you're sending me are approved and you like what you did there. And you've chosen tones, and you don't send 13 guitar mics and the DI, and the DI and the mics don't even like line up, and it's like different things and all of that. That shouldn't happen if you're producing, because there's your stamp of approval should be on that. You should have listened to that stuff and made a decision, and that's a producer's job. And if you can't do that because you're lacking the experience or you don't know what you want actually, then somebody else should produce, or at least co-produce and guide you.
Yeah, totally. And yeah. If one of the musicians can't play the parts, well, you're the producer. You technically hired them to do this job. It's up to you who you choose.
Totally.
Interesting thought, right?
Yeah. Classic example is when a band says the song is done, we just need a mix, and then all they have are MIDI drums, and they haven't even picked the samples. And I'm like, which drum sound do you want? Like, what did you listen to when you were recording? And they like, we don't care. Just pick something that sounds great. And I'm like, that. Somebody has to make a decision there. You got to have a vision or something, it's something like, whose record is this?
Yeah.
And so, and I understand though that it can be very hard, and I understand where you're coming from and why that is hard to do for you, because a lot of people will then tell me, well, we don't know what a good snare sound is in that context, and we are afraid we're making the wrong decision, and that's totally fine. But then you definitely need input. You definitely need a producer, and you should be talking about that stuff, because otherwise it's just. You can be lucky and the mixer is picking the right stuff, but it can also be completely the wrong direction. And I just think you have to be aware of that and just get some help while you're producing it, because what you hear while you're tracking also determines, everything else. So if you start without any sort of drum sound that you've picked intentionally, then how are you going to make good decisions about the other tones? Mm-hmm. And, so I think it's important to get that feedback not only after it's tracked, but like while you are tracking, and even during pre-production, actually, ideally, there should be a producer that is helping you, who is guiding you, who's giving you feedback and helping you with these decisions. That's the producer's job, really. He doesn't have to turn the knobs, but he or she has to have the vision and the big picture in mind and guide you towards that.
Yeah, totally. And that, like, I think, Benny, you and I both consider ourselves to still be involved in production even when we're mixing.
Yeah.
Like we're not in the studio with the band at all.
Yeah.
We're still making production decisions in the mix. Like this producer role has been dispersed amongst everyone. It's fascinating. So when I was engineering, I was also a producer. When you are the band recording, you're now part of the production team as well. And like the job's been kind of like dispersed because nobody's just doing that anymore, which is a shame, but a reality as well. If you have the budget and you can hire an isolated producer, fantastic. But we're called the Self-Recording Band, so chances are, if you're listening to this, that's you. And I guess what we're trying to say is own that more. Like, just really own it and think, okay, like, what do I want to accomplish here? Not like the job isn't just capture the songs that we've written. It's make a product, produce a song.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so there's one more definition of a producer, I think, that sometimes people have in mind, and that is totally genre dependent. I think if people are more into like electronic music, hip hop, and that sort of stuff, I think a producer is often considered someone who's like making beats or something. You know,
Right.
I often hear people talk about a producer, and they mean someone who's making the beats, the music that somebody else then lays like tracks vocals to. You know.
Yeah.
So
Which is
yeah. And I don't even say that's wrong. I think that's just what people call it.
it's almost more right.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, they're doing the same thing. They're just doing it all on their own before it reaches the person that's going to sing on it, right? You know, how they're building that beat is entirely up to their decisions. So they're producing start to finish, really. Now, tricky because I that does exist in other genres too. Songwriters, you know, that produce a recording for somebody to then sing on. Not as common as it is in like the beat making world, but it's kind of the same thing when you really break it down. But you wouldn't hire a beat maker to necessarily to come produce your rock band, I guess.
No, I mean, no.
You could, but
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. No. So, yeah. Bottom line, I think I would love to work with Rick Rubin, and he
So
wouldn't
bad.
have to. He wouldn't have to touch any knob. Like I would be just fine with him on the couch there, giving me his opinion. I think he has something that is just. I think this is a case of you can't really learn that stuff, at least not to get to this level. I mean, to get to this level, you have to have some sort of, I don't know, creative genius. He has something that we don't have. I think parts of it can be learned, but I'm sure, like, yeah, he's got something. I don't know.
Well, see, I think it can totally be learned. I just think that most of us don't develop those skills, right?
Yeah, that's the proper way to put it. Yeah,
because he like all the time we spent learning engineering, he didn't, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
His time has been spent developing skills that most people are keeping, just having like a minimum level of, you know, it's like, all right, I gotta like at least be able to produce at this level, but really I'm into engineering and making sick tones and sick mixes and stuff like that. And that's fine. That's valuable skills as well. But if you want to be a Rick Rubin, you shouldn't be worrying about those things. You should be worrying about the Rick Rubin things.
Exactly. And yeah, totally. And so if you listen to that interview and you hear him talk about creativity and about creating songs and making music and the way he thinks about this, part of it is like being super mindful and present. So he meditates, he does all kinds of things to stay healthy, to be totally in the moment. He doesn't want any distractions. So he's very, very present and mindful. He limits the amount of time that he spends on the project intentionally, not because he wants to get paid more per hour, but I truly believe that this is not his intention. His intention is really to be efficient and not get distracted, because after a while you will be distracted. That mindfulness present part is fascinating to me, and it's fascinating how he does it. So in this interview, the interviewer asks him why there are no like platinum records and gold records on the walls and all these plaques that he got over the years. None of that is at his studio, at his place. And he was like, I find those things to be a distraction. And at some point, I just sent them to my mom, and I honestly don't even know where they are at the moment. I don't care. Like, he doesn't care about it. And he just thinks it's a distraction, because if they are on the walls, he says, if I see those things, I will subconsciously try and aim for those things, and I will try and beat that or be as successful as that other record or whatever. And I don't want to even see those targets. I just want to see blank white walls and not be distracted by anything. And I'm just going to listen to what comes out of the speakers, and that's all I want in that moment, which I think is totally fascinating.
It is fascinating. Yeah, he's deciding what the goal is, and that's pretty clever, I think.
Yeah. And the other question that was great was, and his answer was, he says, the audience comes last. So he talks about that all that matters is how the songs connect. And of course, it's for an audience. And of course, the goal is to be commercially successful and all of that. But still, he says the audience comes last. And when the reporter asks why that is, he says, because the audience doesn't know what they want yet. The audience only knows things that are already out there. They only know things that already exist. And I want to make something that doesn't already exist. So I can't pay attention to the audience, because they will tell me things that already exist, and that's not what I want to make. So that's pretty clever too. So he cares about whether or not people like it, but he can't ask the audience basically what they want, because they don't know what they want, and he needs to approach it differently.
Yeah, yeah, that's a fascinating thought too.
Yeah.
Like if you're, yeah, there's so much wisdom in that guy. Like, and again, the proof is in the pudding. Like the work he's put out is crazy, crazy successful across multiple genres. Like he's put out some of my favorite music, but he's also worked with like all of these crazy pop stars that I've never even listened to. Like,
Yeah.
like it's so wild. So there's something there. If you're not aware, it sounds like he put out a book, and that's kind of why he's appearing in the media. I'm going to
Yeah.
pick that up for sure,
Me
just
too.
to get a glimpse into this guy's brain.
Me too. It's a book on creativity that is, I don't know if it's already out or if it's coming out, but it's like, yeah, he's promoting it right now. Yeah, and yeah, as you said, all the different genres. That's fascinating too. He has a hip hop background, I think,
Mhm.
and then that's where he comes from. And he's being modest to a degree. We have to say that because he started out using like samplers, putting beats together, and working. So he has
Some
had his
technical
fingers and
skills, yeah.
hand on music gear at some point. There is video footage of him sitting at consoles balancing things, but it's not that he knows these things in and out. Of course, he can move a fader and he has a feel for that, but that's not where he spends his time. But he
Yeah.
has a hip hop background, and then he went on to work with Metallica or
System of a Down,
yeah,
Red Hot Chili Peppers,
yeah,
Slipknot,
yeah,
yeah, all
Johnny
over.
Cash,
Johnny Cash. What?
yeah. And some other like pop stars too, like hip hop, all of it, really all of it.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
So crazy. Maybe something to end this on, a cool conversation I would like to know is, have you ever worked in that kind of situation where there is just a producer?
Yes, I have. Yes, I absolutely have. I have worked on multiple projects where there was a producer, but I was kind of co-producing those. So I had a say too in the whole thing, and we did it together. But then there was one project where it was a label project, and it was fun, but also kind of complicated because there was a manager. The manager got the band a label deal, and then the manager and the label picked the team to produce the record for the band. The band made suggestions, and they ended up hiring a producer, and that producer wanted me to be mixing and engineering and tracking and engineering. And so it was this mix of the label and the manager wanted somebody completely different. The band wanted to work with that producer because they knew the producer. The producer wanted to work with me because he knew me. And in the end, it was super complicated because the guys who were paying for it didn't really fully trust me because they would have hired someone else.
Right.
And it was this weird situation of like all these different people who had no idea of what they're talking about.
Power dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. But everybody, you know these situations where people just comment on something so they can comment. Like there's no substance behind it. They just feel important when they comment. It's their job. Yeah, that was one of these projects. It turned out fine and it was fun, but it was also not easy to handle because so many people were having opinions and having demands and
oh man,
requests.
That is such a secret little nugget of wisdom to offer up and coming bands that are building their way through the biz right now. Is as you grow, you're gonna build a team, get a manager, maybe a couple managers, because often they work with a team, a publicist, a booking agent. The list goes on. Not all of those people deserve a seat at the music table.
Exactly.
In fact, arguably none of them do.
Yes.
Because you're the musician.
Very true.
And they're all going to want to, well, I mean, not all of them. My agent never tried to give me feedback on our music, but yeah, it's crazy how people think they've earned that, and that's the whole thing that you got there from is your music. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, totally. I remember the final listening session when we wrapped up the mix, and the producer, the manager was sitting at the back of my studio on the couch there, and I told him multiple times to be sitting in the sweet spot here and having a listen here, and like I told him to like rotate and everybody gets a seat, and listen to the music as it's supposed to sound like, because back there it sounds nothing like it sounds here, and I told him that, but he refused to, and he was just on the couch, and he kept commenting and like, the low end is crazy and that kick drum is way too big, or like, but in this song that bass part is not loud enough, or whatever, like these things. And I was like, please come and have a seat here in the sweet spot. It's like very different. But he refused to, and he was like, no, I'm sitting here and I'm listening from here, because imagine like the consumer doesn't sit in the sweet spot either. And I'm like, yeah, that's not really a good argument. Like, you don't understand how this works. It's like,
yeah, just gonna sit in a random spot, and that's
Yeah.
like, yeah.
It was so terrible. And
That's too bad.
Yeah.
My experiences with working with producers was awesome. Like, yeah. So my band did a record with Eric Ratz, big producer, and he also can engineer like the best of them.
Yeah.
But
sorry, I have to say though, just so people don't get it wrong, I have to say though, the producer was awesome. It was the
Oh, sweet.
manager. It was the manager who was sitting in there at the. He shouldn't even. He said he shouldn't even have been at the listening session, honestly. The producer and the band and myself would have been enough, but the manager was the problem. And I'm not afraid to say that, even if he ends up listening to this episode. But the producer was amazing, and that collaboration went super well. And I was very glad to be, so that I could be able to focus on the engineering, and I had a producer with a clear vision, and he communicated with the band, and that was all awesome. It was just the manager and the label. They were the problem.
Sweet.
So.
Yeah. I could see that. Yeah. We allowed, one of my managers was very actively involved in the music, and we were fine with it. Like, I think that was a good relationship, that you have to make that decision. Make it actively. Don't just assume because they want to give input that they deserve to be there. But yeah, so I got to make a record with Eric Ratz, and he was our producer. He did do some engineering, but for the most part, he just wanted to keep the production hat on. So we had his assistant engineer, Ryan Jones engineering, plus the studio staff at the warehouse, which is like insane engineers there too. So it was like really like the coolest. I actually got to try the old way, of just being a musician there, and being worried about the songs and my playing, essentially, right, and the band. And that was awesome. Super awesome, and cool hearing how ideas came up instead of from an engineering standpoint, not being like, like the guitars need to be bigger. He's just like, oh, we need more energy in this part of the song. Like, that's that language is defining in itself. It doesn't say like we need more guitar because we happen to be working on guitars. It's just we need more energy. What equals energy in this part, right?
Yeah.
And all sorts of ideas came up from that. Like guitar ideas came up, percussion ideas came up, and keys ideas came up. And I think we ended up using all three of them to fill that void. So like, really great experience on that side, for sure. I loved it. And then as an engineer, I did a record only a couple of years ago, I think. We just did like 3 country songs with my buddy Chris Erickson, and he produced, I engineered, and I thought it turned out great. He was just so pre-production and songwriting focused, and it paid off huge, I think. And he also hired an incredible band as a result, I think, too. Yeah, home run.
Awesome. That sounds like fun. Yeah, these are ideal scenarios. So I definitely think that if you're able to work with a great producer and a great team, this is always, if you can do that, if you can afford that, any record will benefit from that. I think there's almost never a bad idea. It's just a bad idea when not the producer is the problem, but when people have opinions who don't know anything about the whole thing, which is often the case in the music industry too. So I only care about the people who are making the music, the artists and their producers, and those people. That's who I care about when I'm engineering, or mixing. And you gotta listen to the other people too, but honestly, to me they're not as important because it's about the art.
Yeah.
So
totally.
yeah, but producers, good producer is very cool to work with people like that, and just being able to focus on the big picture, and as you said, on that language that you use there, that really is it. Where it's not about I want more 2.5K like stuff, but it needs more.
When you're engineering and producing, you can't help but try and solve the problem with the tool that's in your hand at that moment. So it's like, all right, we're on guitars. How do we make this sound big with guitars? But you're going to figure out a way to do that. But maybe that's the wrong. Like, it would have ended up totally different if you were on keys when that idea came to you, right? So, tricky thing. It's hard because most bands can't afford to hire somebody just to do that job anymore. So that's kind of why this landscape has developed into this hybrid of engineer producers, and now musician engineer producer.
Yeah, totally.
But I think the more that you think of it as its own job, the better result you're going to have.
Yes, totally. Maybe you can sort of assign roles within the band. That's something I teach a lot in our coaching program too, where if you are a band, maybe there's one person who has no technical ability, but they are like very creative and have the vision. They are the band leader or the main songwriter, or maybe they can be the producer, and then another person might be the tech savvy person who likes to really nerd out about all these things and like tweak and turn knobs, and then you can create a team where you have sort of your own specialists inside the band. That could work very well too. Totally. And having these sort of roles and boundaries can sometimes help, because then it's a matter of like mutual trust and everybody being able to focus on what they're best at, and that can lead to great results. So maybe there's that, because I've seen it often where there's this one person in the band who is the producer or the engineer. Like almost every band has one person with a DAW and with technical ability these days, but that doesn't mean that this person also has to be the producer. Maybe they need to trust somebody else in the band and be like, hey, I am willing to track this and mix this and engineer this or whatever, but could you be like the outside perspective and the sort of producer and the guide? And if they can trust someone else in the band, that could be very beneficial too.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea, because it does tend to go that way where the person with the DAW ends up doing all of it, and it's just not very effective.
Yeah. No. All right. So as always, let us know if you have any follow-up questions on that topic, and feel free to start a discussion in the Facebook community, of course, when we post the episode. I will absolutely get this book, and maybe we get to talk about some of the things in the book after we've read it both.
Totally. I'm sure so many good ideas will come up as we go through it.
Yeah, I think so too. All right. Thank you for listening. As always, if you got value out of this episode, please share it with your friends. Make a screenshot, post it on your social, post it on Instagram, tag us at Benedictine, at Malcolm Owen Flood, at the Self-Recording Band. We appreciate that. We share it, we comment, we do whatever. Send us a message, we'll definitely reply or even make an episode out of it. Depends on the question. So definitely reach out to us and share it with your friends and help us reach more people like you.
Yeah. And I got one more thing here. If this is like a teaser without a teaser, if Benny and I were to end up in the same country at some time, what would you want us to do? As a self-recording band consumer, what would you like to see from us if we actually ended up in the same place? Would you like us to do like some in-person video podcasts? Would you like us to try and make a course together? Would you like us to make some drum samples or guitar IRs or something like that? What is your dream collaboration from Benny and I actually existing in the same place for once?
Maybe it's like wildlife photography in the Alps.
Yeah. You want to see a non-music related stuff? We'll do some pub crawls and wildlife photography.
Yeah. Exactly. Totally. Yeah. Let us know. Curious to hear. I don't know why you would want to know that, Malcolm, but maybe.
Yeah. The chances of us actually getting into the same place, I'm still convinced that's just totally mythical and never going to happen. But maybe it will.
Maybe it will. Who knows? All right. Thank you for listening. Talk to you next week.
See ya. Bye.